very much, Professor. I am also grateful for inviting me to this cooperation, and I value this very much. And well, I would like to, because the conference and the topic of our research within our project run in the Central European Academy is a kind of question. Yes, it's a kind of question about the future, whether European integration goes into the direction of some supranational, more or less unified state, or it will be still a complex of somehow independent states. And I would like to, I'm deeply convinced that the end, so this mysterious end of this process should be already known to us. And this is the reason why I have asked the question. No, there is no title of my talk. Do we really have that choice? This is choice between federalization and coexistence, cohabitation of different states within the European Union. I think we don't have such a choice. Of course, the question is still open when the process will be accomplished. But the end of this process is, in my opinion, already determined. Because the nature of this process is well established, and my thesis is that today contemporary process of European integration is only a one stage, the most recent stage, of some much longer process of modernization of Western societies. And of course we are speaking about Western societies in the meaning of in the dimension of Europe, but looking for the United States, we can see that they also started with some independent states, yes, and they are no longer so much federalized, and so these are no longer coexisting states, but the Federal Union has more and more power, and no one is expecting that it will have less and less power. The process is in certain direction towards more centralized government. Of course, only in some areas, but surprisingly, most important areas. So if in other areas there is possibility for diversity, for different approaches, etc., etc. So I would like to propose to go deeper, to look deeper into this process. I would like to propose you, at least my idea of this process, the stage of which is today's contemporary European integration. And in this way, I would like to justify my position that the process is already set as to the and determined as to the end of this process. And the open question is about when we will end this process. Of course, the end of this stage of the process, which will start the next stage of the same process. So the process is rather directed towards everlasting continuity. Here I would like to remind what I have said already during the discussion, that everything is already determined by very philosophical foundations of our intellectual culture. Sorry for this very abstract dimension of stating the problem on such an abstract ground, Professor Silagin knows that I like to start with such an abstract approach, but still I believe that it has really direct link into the real operation of our institutions, etc. And it is informative in this respect. So it explains real process, why it goes in such a direction. So we are no longer living in the state where some perfect construction is expected to last unchanged. We are rather expecting that everything will change, will modernize, will be better, smarter, quicker, easier, etc., etc. So we are living within the intellectual culture which is focused on the process, ongoing process, all the time. In 16th century, the Republic of Venice was proud to present itself that their system of government is perfect because it is unchanged for 1,000 of years. And now if we've got the constitution which has about 50 years, we can see that, oh, it is not fitting our times. Yes. Of course, it is modernized by constitutional courts, etc., which are writing down parallel constitution in the constitutional case law. So the need for changing the text of the constitution is not so urgent. But if we don't have this parallel constitution written by the constitutional courts, we should still provide changes to the text of the constitution, whereas constitutional courts providing us the ever-working engine of the ever-changing constitution. We have experience already in the team directed by Professor Warga with the concept of constitutional identity, which is of course seen from the perspective of national state as a last defense line between before unifying us integrating us within European Union as a supranational structure. And today we are approaching very similar process, the same process, but from other perspective, from more European perspective, asking how it can be, this integration could be promoted in which direction. I believe that we've got what was very fundamental for starting this process. Well, every time if we are asking about the beginning answers, we can start with different points depending on our perspective, yes? So making things more simple, I would say that we have started with starting to think about human being, about man, in terms of individual. So in believing that we are individuals. This is now ever-bounding anthropology within our Western culture. Yes, everything is subjected to this fundamental perspective about human being, that human being is free and equal. It is individual. And because it is free and equal from the very nature, so this nature, so the freedom and the equality, should be protected. Yes, and it deserves some structures, some procedures, some institutions which will be protecting equality and freedom of individuals. And everything is subordinated to these basic assumptions. Of course, in different states, we are implementing this agenda in slightly different way, but still in a very similar way, because the goal is all the time the same. And when we look back into the 17th or 18th century, we can see that the first stage, it was to to take the power from the decentralized, or actually pre-centralized structures, feudal structures of the feudal society, because feudal society was administered not by any state officials, that were self-government, social self-government of different corporations, yes, that was corporate society with some kinds of self-government. And then, while the process of centralization, so well described by Alexis de Tocqueville in his ancient regime and the revolution, when this process started, those social structures were abolished and royal administration took over their competences. Then it appeared that those officials who initially were considered as liberating people from the rule of those feudal structures needs also some supervision. Yes, so, and this was the beginning of the administrative law and administrative courts in France with the Conseil d'État, which was ruling, which was supervising all administration, providing also some scheme for dispute resolutions between citizens and officials. Yes, common law courts were not interested in going into the dispute between citizen and official when dealing about property, freedom, etc., etc. So the new jurisdiction, administrative courts were necessary to be established. So that, and it directed us towards the rule of the administration. So the administration, first royal administration, was at the very beginning of the modern state. It was the true sovereign. Yes. After that, the move was towards providing some supervision, some control, social control over this administration. So parliamentary assemblies were necessary for some civic oversight over the royal administration. In the 19th century, in the beginning, those parliaments were not legislative bodies. They provided social control over administration. Then they started to be consulted during the legislative process, to be more and more involved in this legislative process, but still don't have a real sovereign power of lawmaking. Look, this is very similar situation to European Union now. This is Commission, which has predominant position in legislation. Parliament is consulting, expressing opinion. Of course, it started with some consultation, discussion, etc. With time, with democratization of the elections, etc., the position of the European Parliament is stronger and stronger, but it started with some social control over the international administration as established in the European Union. So we've got parallel processes, of course, in time, in different periods of time, but the nature of this process is very the same. And so this is also part of my argument that the process is still the same. Yes? And with time, the parliaments took over the control over the administration with the principle of legality, so with subordination of administration to legislation, and administrative courts started to control the administration on the basis of legality principle, yes? And the real sovereign power moved to the parliaments. Looking from the other side, this is affirmation of democratic principles, so equality and freedom, because we are free people who are determining who is ruling, and we've got equal, we should at least have an equal right to vote, etc. The process was complicated in different states. It took a different shape, but the direction was still the same. And once the parliamentary states in the beginning of 20th century started, the idea of some control over the parliament also started. So the Kelsen, as mentioned by Professor Safata, with his idea of constitutional courts, which constitutional courts, if we look into the very origin of this jurisdiction, their first task was to provide the dispute resolutions between the members of the federation. That was in Austria, that was also in Germany in time the very idea of constitutional control started, and only then, because, well, while dealing with the disputes between the members of the federation, we have to operate upon the ground of constitution. So the constitution started to be not only political declaration, but also a source of law which is applied by the court. So process of the juridization texts of the constitution started. Yes, now in the second half, in the end of 20th century, it was so much demonstrated in Central Europe. Yes, when constitutional courts in this part of Europe were established and giving the text of the constitution to jurists, to judges, they made out of this political document, they made a source of real law, which is the base for the judgments, and taking the control over the activity of parliaments by the constitutional courts. Those constitutional courts also needed some additional legitimization for their activity, especially because they started to be very activistic, because the text of the constitution, even though with time the constitutions are bigger and bigger, still it is only one piece of legislation, whereas social life is more and more complicated. So we have to we have to find so many solutions in this very small text of the constitution. So judges start to be more and more active. And this is the reason why they started to look outside the state for some documents which were already adapted because states needed some closer cooperation, establishment of common market, etc., etc. This is also parallel to this early modern process, because if we look into the early modern time, the early modern states, national states, started with unification. The meter, it was unknown in Greece or Rome or in Middle Ages. We had very different measures. So the trade was difficult because people are trading with very different measures. And in the 19th century, when we are seeking for some unified market, to sell more, to produce more, etc., we need unified measures. Yes? So, meter. That is the beginning of common market. Yes? After the war, of course, we have established even stronger this common market, because we abolished the borders for national borders for trading. But in the 18th century, physiocrats were doing this in France when they abolished the internal borders to the trade in France, because they also wanted a common market. Yes. So again, the process is parallel, is very much the same. So actually, process is driven by our zeal towards the affirmation of this new anthropology of making people free and equal. Therefore, freedom of movement, freedom of trade, etc., etc. And it started somewhere in 17th, 18th century, first with some books about individuals and how the state of individuals should be constructed. This gave the beginning to modern state, modern nation state, national state, and now we are on the stage of producing some superstructures, so postmodern state over national state, and in Europe it is European Union. And this is the reason why I'm saying that we don't have a choice between coexistence and federation. So they move towards the unified political structure. This end was already determined when we accepted somewhere in 18th century this anthropological approach to human being as an individual. Because it is individual who is seeking protection against structures, social structures, political structures also, which are close to him, and it is applying to some superstructure for defense against this closer structure. And we can see this process today when lower courts are not asking Supreme Court, but asking preliminary question to Luxembourg. So this superstructure, which was created by in the meantime, has no implementation agencies, as Professor Grazer already mentioned this. But it has, of course, national structures, which are more and more subjected to this superstructure. How? Well, it is providing the antagonisms and promoting antagonisms within the institutions of national state, because then those institutions have some autonomy against institutions which are higher in the national hierarchy. They don't have to obey Supreme Court if they could follow and obey, of course, if Luxembourg Court or Strasbourg Court, etc., etc. And they are then protected by the European Union, by the superstructure, against national structures. So every time there is this process is directed toward disintegration of lower structures for sake of the superstructures, for which in time are taking, first they are taking control, and they are taking the real direct power over certain areas of social life. So theories are very much important, first of all, in order to provide us with some narrative which is making us comfortable, that it's not so bad as it looks like. Yes. So this is somehow therapeutical dimension of legal theory, which is providing us with some explanation, consolation, and we are not so nervous in this respect after listening to some explanation from experts. Yes. So the process could go on because we are not so nervous. Yes. When people start to be nervous, then it appears that they are populists. That they are looking for populists who are trying to lead them against this process. Well, I would like to say, because I don't know exactly, but I'm afraid that I am speaking already too long. So I will go to the end. So I would like to say that there is no alternative in the given culture, intellectual culture conditions. As long as we still continue to think about human being in terms of individual, free and equal, we will go this path. And there is, of course, we can try to make some deviations from these general directions, but they are only partial deviations, and we will sail as as sailors, but still directing to, but still these general directions will be kept. And in order to start to think about integration in other terms than going towards the unified political structure, however we will call it, now we can say, we can speak about supranational postmodern state, yes? Because this, why I have mentioned the issue of constitutional identity. This process is all the time at the expense of lower structures, yes? So today, in order to integrate more European states, we have to just deconstruct their structures. So this is the reason why they don't have to obey the hierarchy within the national state. It's enough that they obey hierarchy within the superstructure, within European Union. So they could avoid this basic national structure. So this process was already, from quite different perspective, described, for example, in the idea of by Ulrich Beck and Edgar Grande in their book on cosmopolitan empire, yes, when they say that this process actually does not require European Union to have all the powers, all the features of national state. It is enough that it is using now structures of the national states, but it is keeping some control over some crucial elements. European Union, says Beck, plays an increasing role in establishing the rules, but does not have financial resources and administrative capacity to make them rules as a reality and apply them. That was written 20 years ago. Today, we already know that the European Union have achieved the competence to provide direct taxes for European taxes. So after 20 years, it is no longer true, but demonstrates the direction in which we are proceeding all the time. It is still the task of national states, and there is no sign that it will change in the future. Of course, it has changed already. So this this is no longer describing the real situation. So this process is going forward. So, and one more thing, what we are still discussing now today, because today we are observing those changes which are taking place on our eyes. And the discussion about the rule of law is back to the agenda. when there was a transformation in the beginning of 90s in Central Europe, all the Central European countries were discussing again the Rechtsstaatprinzip and the rule of law principle, because actually this principle of the rule of law, it is the idea which is to be implemented, which never will be implemented totally in 100%, because it's not the goal of this idea to be implemented fully. The goal is to promote, to animate the process which is going into the direction of autonomization, of providing more and more autonomy for individuals. Providing more and more autonomy for individuals, it is also building stronger and stronger structures which will provide this autonomy to individuals, because those individuals should be liberated from social boundaries in order to make independent choices. Look at the relationship between public authorities and children. It is the question how to protect children, so how to protect them from parents and other relatives, to provide them more protection, to provide them autonomy, to provide them possibility to act according to their will, even if they are very small. Yes? So this process of liberation is also the process of making stronger and stronger structures. We don't need strong family because we've got social insurances. So there is an institution which is caring about our life when we become elderly men. We don't need no longer children who will care about us, because there is social insurance institution which will provide resources. There are some institutions which will provide direct care over us if we pay them from the social insurance money, etc. So this liberation of human being has its reverse side, that is building stronger and stronger institutions. And the idea of the rule of law is the idea how to provide more and more autonomy to citizens, to individuals. When we are achieving the next stage of this modernization, so this autonomization, then the discourse about the rule of law is more and more important and more politicized. Because today, those who are speaking about the rule of law, these are politicians in the first place. And in Poland, for example, we were speaking about państwo prawne as a translation of Rechtsstaat to Polish. But because the discourse about rule of law in the European Union is run in English, so the rule of law is translated into Polish as a rządy prawa, not the państwo prawne. So we started again to use rządy prawa, so the rule of law, instead of this terminology which was already established in the 90s and was believed to be more legal, more proper, etc., etc. But the predominant use of this expression was this used by the politicians, which were not informed about the scientific consensus as to the terminology, but actually it was the discussion about politics, not about law. Law is only an instrument for implementation of political decisions. And therefore, of course, we are discussing our case law, our doctrines, constructions, etc. But at the end of the day, we have to implement some political decision, because this is binding decision. Yes, whether it is taken by the Parliament or by the European Court Court of Justice of the European Union. But this is also a political decision. So the concept of rule of law as a political idea which is promoting the political change within the social structures, within the states or some supranational structures, depending on the stage of this process. And so, to make conclusion, in my opinion, as long as we don't discover or rediscover human being to be a social being more than individual solipsistic being, we will go this path towards the federalization, because the intrinsic logic of this process, of this dialectical process, when we've got, I have already mentioned that it presupposes the internal contradiction within the being, which is dynamizing the being and starts this dialectical process. As long as we are thinking about man in terms of individual, we will continue this path towards some federal, unified superstructure. So we don't have a choice between federation and coexistence unless we change this very basic concept of human being. But this is absolutely difficult and harder to imagine. I don't say it is impossible. Thank you very much.